In the shadow of Pendle Hill, Lancashire's fields and moors lie veiled in mist. Whispers travel with the wind, carrying tales of curses, charms, and the devil's hand. Hardship breeds suspicion here, and suspicion breeds fear. From this soil, the seeds of witchcraft took root and refused to die. The poor who lived beneath Pendle's looming slopes faced hunger, disease, and endless toil. Superstition clung like frost to their breath. A failed crop was never mere misfortune, nor sickness a simple ailment. Behind every shadow lurked unseen hands, and every quarrel could be twisted into proof of witchcraft. Torches burned in the night, flickering like warnings against the darkness. Neighbors whispered of cunning folk who healed with herbs or cursed with words. Fear walked hand in hand with need, for the same woman who eased pain might also doom a cow or curdle milk. Survival and suspicion could never be separated. Above all, loomed the church and the crown. King James himself wrote of witches, declaring them enemies of God. Priests thundered from pulpits, reminding villagers that Satan worked not only in distant lands, but in the very cottages they passed each day. Fear was not rumor alone. It was sanctioned from the highest throne. Court records preserved the echoes of these whispers, testimony inked in trembling hands. But words, like wome, twisted as they rose. Confessions became stories, and stories became evidence. In Lancaster's halls, whispers hardened into law, and the moors themselves seemed to groan beneath the weight of suspicion. Pendle Hill became more than landscape. It was legend. Its shadow stretched not only across the fields, but into hearts. For here, poverty, superstition, and power collided, shaping a tale that would echo for centuries. On these moors, fear became witchcraft, and witchcraft became history. The reign of King James I was marked by paranoia. His book, Demonology, declared witches real and dangerous, fueling hunts across the kingdom. What had been whispered in cottages was now endorsed by crown and church alike. The king's fear became law, and law turned fear into action. England became a stage for witchcraft's grim theatre. James feared plots both earthly and infernal. He believed witches had raised storms to drown him at sea. Ministers echoed his words, weaving Satan into sermons. The devil was no longer distant but present, hiding in villages, stirring misfortune. Under his rule, the smallest quarrel could spiral into a trial. Pendle, poor and isolated, felt the weight of this royal obsession. Villagers who once feared gossip now feared the crown itself. For when the king declared witches enemies of God, every magistrate, minister, and neighbor became eager to seek them out. Fear now had the sanction of power. Witchcraft was no longer only superstition. It became political, a weapon of control. To accuse was to prove loyalty. To doubt was to risk suspicion. The kingdom became a chessboard of paranoia, with witches as pawns sacrificed for order. Fear seeped downward, from palace to parish, touching every hearth. Thus England entered a season of dread. With the king himself obsessed, magistrates sharpened their quills, ministers sharpened their tongues, and villagers sharpened their whispers. In this atmosphere, Pendle's soil lay waiting. Seeds of suspicion would soon take root, watered by sermons and ink, destined to grow into rope and gallows. Pendle Hill loomed over a countryside marked by hunger and lawlessness. Its villages were scattered, its people bound by poverty. Families survived on scraps, trading favors and charms. With little order and weaker oversight, the land became fertile ground for suspicion. When hardship struck, the moor seemed to whisper blame into every ear. The people of Pendle lived close to the edge. Crops failed, livestock sickened, and children died young. To survive was to rely on one another, yet mistrust poisoned even kin. A loan unpaid or butter spoiled could sour into feud. In such soil, gossip grew as quickly as thistles. The law rarely reached Pendle. Magistrates came only when quarrels grew bloody or cattle were stolen. Thus neighbors settled disputes through curses and charms. The moor was both shield and prison, isolating its people from authority, yet leaving them vulnerable to one another's accusations. Religion added to division. Catholics clung to hidden rites. Protestants denounced them as heresy. Villages were fractured by faith as well as hunger. A candle lit in secrecy could be seen as rebellion or sorcery. Suspicion was not only neighborly, it was political, woven into every act of survival. Pendle's people endured beneath the looming shadow of hunger, faith, and quarrel. When whispers of witchcraft arose, they were not foreign intruders, but familiar voices. The moors themselves seemed to echo them back. Thus, when trials came, the people of Pendle found themselves already living in a world half haunted by witches. In Pendle, not all witches were feared. Some were sought. Cunning folk, healers, charm makers, and wise women offered remedies when physicians were absent. They set bones, mixed herbs, and muttered prayers over sick cattle. For the poor, they were essential. Yet the same hands that healed could be accused of harm when fortunes soured. Herbs hung from rafters, bones buried beneath thresholds, charms tied to infants' cradles. These acts were common, accepted as part of daily life. But the church frowned, calling them witchcraft disguised as medicine. A whispered blessing could save a child, or serve as evidence in court when misfortune followed. The line between healer and witch was thin, drawn not by action, but by circumstance. A cure that worked brought gratitude. A cure that failed brought suspicion. Gratitude could turn to accusation overnight. Survival in Pendle depended not only on skill, but on luck. Cunning folk often came from families long tied to the land, passing knowledge through generations. Their power was feared and respected, for to anger them was to risk curse. They lived at the edge of community, both needed and resented. Their existence was a fragile balance between service and suspicion. Thus, the folk practices that once sustained Pendle became weapons. What had been charms for milk or blessings for childbirth turned into evidence of pacts with the devil. When trials came, the healers stood accused as witches, their remedies rewritten as curses, their prayers as blasphemy. Pendle was torn between faiths. Catholics clung to hidden rites. Protestants policed them. A candle lit in secrecy could be devotion or treason. In this fractured land, neighbors watched neighbors with wary eyes. Poverty deepened suspicion, for the hungry looked for blame, and the church offered answers carved in scripture. Quarrels grew sharper. A beggar denied bread could mutter a curse. A cow's death became punishment for stinginess. Families marked by misfortune found themselves accused. In an age when survival balanced on chance, no mishap was free from suspicion. Fear transformed coincidence into evidence. The church's sermons thundered against sin. Ministers named witches as proof of Satan's presence. For villagers already burdened by hunger, these words carried weight. They explained why crops failed, why children died, why quarrels lingered. Witchcraft was not abstract. It was woven into their daily struggle. The moors amplified fear. Mists rolled over the hills, shaping imagination. A figure glimpsed at dusk could be healer or demon. Shadows stretched long, and whispers seemed to carry voices. The landscape itself seemed to conspire with suspicion, turning Pendle into stage for unseen horrors. Thus religion, poverty, and superstition converged. The people of Pendle, trapped by hunger and watched by ministers, lived in constant unease. It would take little more than a spark to ignite hysteria. The soil was ready, the moors waiting, the gallows already casting their long shadows. By 1612, all was set for hysteria. Pendle was poor, divided, suspicious. Ministers thundered, magistrates waited, villagers whispered. Misfortune needed no cause, but found one in witches. The soil of Lancashire held both hunger and fear, and together they grew into accusations. The people were ready to believe, and the law was ready to act. Children repeated warnings as rhymes, mothers invoked witches to frighten them, and men spoke of charms in taverns. Fear became inheritance, passed like heirloom from one generation to the next. Each retelling sharpened suspicion, each tale preparing ears to hear Satan's name behind every quarrel. Neighbors remembered grudges. A denied favor, a spoiled butter, a sudden illness, all resurfaced as evidence. The past became weapon. Every village feud turned into proof of witchcraft. Memory itself became dangerous, for to recall an insult was to risk condemning its author as servant of the devil. Thus whispers thickened into smoke. Villagers traded tales like coin, each one heavier than the last. The moors no longer echoed only with wind, but with accusation. Fear blurred with truth, and superstition hardened into certainty. The gallows loomed before the first rope was tied. The seeds had been sown. When the peddler collapsed, when confessions followed, it was no surprise. Pendle's soil had long been prepared. The hill's shadow held them all, and its mist curled like a warning. Witchcraft had not been born. It had been waiting. Elizabeth Southerns, known as Demdike, ruled her family from a crumbling cottage near Pendle Hill. Blind and aged, she carried a reputation older than memory. Villagers whispered that she had practiced witchcraft for 50 years, selling charms and curses alike. To some, she was healer. To others, she was terror incarnate. Her family lived in poverty, surviving on scraps. They leaned on her reputation, for fear brought coin. People came to her door for remedies, for hexes, for protection against curses. Yet each whispered exchange added weight to her name, building a legend that would soon be used as evidence. Demdike's kin carried her shadow. Alazon Device, her granddaughter, inherited both skill and suspicion. The family's life revolved around magic, whether real or imagined. The Demdikes were marked not only by hunger, but by the devil's rumor. They were feared as much as pitied. Neighbors remembered curses muttered after quarrels, animals sickening, children wasting away. Each tale sharpened the picture of Demdike as witch. Her blindness did not weaken her image. It deepened it, as if unseen eyes watched through otherworldly sight. In whispers, she became not woman, but matriarch of shadows. Thus the Demdikes entered history already cloaked in suspicion. Their poverty made them vulnerable, their reputation damning. When the spark came, it would not fall on dry ground. It would strike tinder waiting to burn. Demdike's name was both shield and noose, a legacy that condemned her kin. Opposite the Demdikes stood the Chattocks family, led by Anne Whittle. Like Demdike, she was old, feared, and tied to whispers of sorcery. Her kin lived near the same moor, their lives shaped by hunger and survival. The rivalry between the two families stretched back decades, each cursing the other in feud. Anne Chattocks carried her own legend. Villagers recalled muttered spells, sudden deaths, cattle struck ill. Her daughter, Anne Redfern, was feared for skill with clay images used in curses. To their neighbors, the Chattoxes were no less dark than the Demdikes, only enemies with the same reputation. The feud between families was sharp. Accusations flew whenever misfortune struck, each Rasuls blaming the other. A child's sickness could be Demdike's curse, or Chattox's. In such a climate, truth was impossible. Fear wrote its own version of events, and the feud itself became evidence. Both families survived by the same craft: healing, charms, and protection. Both bore the same poverty and suspicion. Yet rivalry made them vulnerable. To accuse one was to condemn both. When law came to Pendle, the feud was ready fuel for fire. Thus Pendle was divided by more than faith or hunger. It was split by two matriarchs, each feared, each accused, each bound by superstition. Demdike and Chattocks became mirror images, their feud a curse upon their kin. And when trials came, both names would be written side by side in blood. The feud between the Demdikes and Chattoxes stretched back through generations. Children were raised on stories of betrayal, quarrels remembered like scars. A gift refused or livestock lost could spark years of hatred. The families lived not side by side, but against one another, every shadow deepened by suspicion. Tales of poisonings and charms circled the moors. Villagers recalled a cow sickening after quarrel, a child wasting away after insult. Each tale linked misfortune to magic, always pointing toward one matriarch or the other. Truth was irrelevant. Memory itself became weapon, sharpened with each retelling. The feud shaped reputation. The Demdikes were whispered to curse with words, the Chattoxes to curse with images. Each misfortune fit the story already believed. When crops failed, both were blamed, though by different means. The feud gave villagers two scapegoats, each feared and hated in equal measure. In poverty, grudges grew sharper. Hunger left no room for forgiveness. Each family saw the other as thief, liar, or worse. To survive meant to curse the rival, if not aloud, then in thought. For Pendle's poor, quarrels were not only disputes, they were lifelines poisoned by suspicion. Thus, by 1612, the feud was legend, woven into Pendle soil. Children carried it like inheritance. Neighbors repeated it like scripture. When accusations began, the family's history was ready, written not in parchment, but in memory. The trial would only give voice to what the Moors already whispered. Charms were woven into Pendle's daily life. Herbs hung above doors, bones buried under thresholds, ribbons tied to cradles. To protect, to heal, to curse, magic was both shield and weapon. The line between blessing and blasphemy was thin, drawn not by act, but by judgment. The Demdikes sold charms for coin, offering cures for cattle and children. The Chattoxes used clay figures, believed to cause sickness or death. Villagers sought them in desperation, though they later testified in fear. What was once service became evidence, each charm twisted into proof of sorcery. Faith condemned such practices, but poverty preserved them. With no physicians, villagers relied on cunning folk. They prayed on Sunday, yet bought charms on Monday. Religion and superstition walked side by side, neither banishing the other. To live in Pendle was to live with contradiction. Charms spoke to need as much as belief. A mother would pay for blessing her child, a farmer for curing his cow. But when misfortune lingered, gratitude soured into accusation. The same charm that once brought hope could be cursed as devil's work. Magic was never neutral. It carried risk with every word. Thus, daily life itself became a ledger of suspicion. Herbs in rafters, clay figures buried, whispered words in the night, all waiting to be used against their makers. When trials came, nothing was innocent. Every act, no matter how ordinary, became shadowed by fear. Gossip spread like smoke across Pendle. Whispers in taverns, murmurs in fields, curses muttered in anger, all became part of a growing record. The community became courtroom long before magistrates arrived. By 1612, evidence was already written in memory, waiting only to be spoken aloud. Neighbors repeated tales of Demdike's curses, Chattoxes' clay figures, and quarrels that ended in sickness. The stories changed with each telling, growing sharper. Fear polished gossip into testimony, turning rumor into truth. In a land so poor, words were the cheapest weapon, and the deadliest. Accusations served needs. To blame a witch explained hunger, disease, and death. It gave meaning to misfortune and placed guilt on another's shoulders. In Pendle, to accuse was survival, for to doubt was to risk suspicion yourself. Gossip was shield and sword, both weapon and defense. Thus, when magistrates came, they found not silence, but flood. Villagers eager to speak poured out grievances stored for decades. Old quarrels returned as curses, grudges transformed into evidence. The trial did not create hysteria, it released it, giving legal voice to what villagers had long believed. Pendle's fate was sealed before parchment was signed. The Moors whispered guilt, the villagers echoed it, and the magistrates wrote it down. What began as gossip ended as death. The voices of neighbors became rope around necks, and the feud of families became tragedy of history. In March 1612, Alazon Device met John Law, a travelling peddler, on the road near Colne. She asked for pins, precious in those days for charms and sewing alike. When he refused, anger flashed. She cursed him aloud, words sharp as knives. Within moments the man staggered, stricken with sudden paralysis. The Moor held its breath. Law collapsed, convinced the devil's hand had struck him. His body twisted, his speech broken. To him and to many, this was no illness but witchcraft. He named Alazon his tormentor, and villagers nodded in fear. For curses were never mere words in Pendle. They were weapons believed to pierce flesh and soul alike. Alazon, terrified by her own power, confessed that she had cursed him. Whether guilt or fear drove her words, none could tell. Her admission was taken as proof. A quarrel became witchcraft, a collapse became evidence, and Alazon herself became the spark that lit Pendle's fire. Her family's reputation deepened the suspicion. To accuse a Demdike was to confirm long-held fears. Alazon's curse seemed less accident than legacy. In a land waiting for witches, her words became prophecy fulfilled. John Law's collapse was not seen as chance. It was destiny, shaped by superstition. Thus the spark was struck. What might have been a quarrel on a lonely road became the opening act of Lancashire's great witch panic. The peddler's collapse echoed across moor and village, carried into hearths and courts alike. Fear had been waiting, and now it found its excuse. John Law's affliction was real enough. His face drooped, his words slurred, his limbs failed him. Today we might call it a stroke. But in Pendle, 1612, medicine bowed to fear. His suffering became stage for witchcraft. The devil's hand was declared visible in his twisted body, and villagers gathered to witness. Law himself believed it witchcraft. His testimony carried weight, for a man struck so suddenly seemed cursed. He accused Alazon openly, his words spreading like fire through dry grass. In an age where confession was proof, his suffering became sermon, warning others of witches hiding in plain sight. The story reached Roger Nowell, magistrate of Pendle. Eager to root out witches, he seized upon Law's stroke as opportunity. For years he had heard whispers of Demdike and Chattocks. Now he had cause to act. A single man's collapse became doorway to trial of families. Alazon's confession, given in trembling voice, bound her fate. She begged forgiveness, perhaps for sin, perhaps for accident. But to Nowell, it was enough. Law's body and Alazon's words aligned too neatly. What could have been chance was molded into certainty. Pendle harbored witches. Thus the stroke hardened into history. What may have been illness was sealed as curse. Medicine was absent, reason silenced, fear triumphant. The peddler's collapse was no longer private misfortune. It became the seed of Lancashire's darkest trial. The moors held silence, but the gallows already whispered. Roger Nowell wasted no time. He summoned Alazon and her family for questioning. His quill scratched as their words flowed, shaping testimony into record. The Demdikes and Chattoxes, long whispered of, now stood before authority. What had been gossip became ink, and ink would become rope. Nowell pressed hard, asking of curses, charms, and familiars. He sought devils' pacts and confessions of flight. Fear weighed on the accused, and words spilled in desperation. A slip of the tongue became evidence, a denial twisted into guilt. The more they spoke, the deeper their graves were dug. The rivalry between families flared in testimony. Demdike accused Chattocks. Chattocks accused Demdike. Old grudges resurfaced as proof. What once divided them now united them in ruin, for each accusation widened the net. Nowell needed only to listen. The families destroyed themselves with their own words. Children were questioned too, their words sharpened by fear. Imagination became confession. Confession became evidence. Tales of spectres, of milk souring, of cattle dying filled Nowell's pages. Whether born of fear or fantasy, each word was weighted as truth. The web of suspicion grew thicker. Thus investigation became accusation, accusation became record, and record became doom. The Demdikes and Chattoxes, bound by feud, were now bound by law. Norwell's parchment carried their fates. The moors that once echoed with gossip now echoed with the scratch of quill, the sound of judgment. Fear twisted words into weapons. Interrogations blurred line between truth and survival. The accused confessed to charms, to pacts, to meeting the devil himself. Whether they believed or not mattered little. Their words were shaped by pressure, by the weight of law, by terror of rope. Demdike, old and blind, confessed to familiar spirits. She described shapes and voices that haunted her nights. Her words, perhaps dreams or inventions, were seized as proof. The matriarch's confession sealed her fate. If she admitted guilt, how could her kin claim innocence? Others followed, confessing to curses, to gatherings on the moors, to feasts with the devil. Some sought mercy, some simply broke under pressure. Each confession fed the fire, painting Pendle not as poor village, but as nest of sorcery. Nowell's record swelled with testimony, yet mercy never came. Confession, instead of forgiveness, became chain. Each word deepened suspicion. Each admission tied rope tighter. The court wanted not truth but affirmation, and the accused gave it in terror. To confess was not salvation. It was doom written in one's own voice. Thus the moor's whispers hardened into certainty. The accused condemned themselves in desperation, their voices rising like smoke. The more they spoke, the more they were bound. Confession did not free, it silenced, ensuring Pendle's tale would end in gallows, not absolution. The accusations spread beyond the families. Neighbors came forward, adding names, adding fuel. What began with Alazon and the peddler became a village consumed. Each confession birthed another. Each name drew more. Fear grew contagious, passing from hearth to hearth like fire through dry straw. Janet Device, a child of 9, was brought forth. Her words, sharpened by pressure, accused her own kin. The image of a child condemning mother, brother, and sister shocked the court. Yet her testimony was taken as pure, her innocence turned into weapon that cut her family down. The moors seemed to darken with each name added. Pendle, once isolated, now carried reputation of witch's nest. Law and superstition fused into frenzy. Nowell gathered every whisper, shaping them into chain of evidence. The trial was no longer investigation. It was performance of fear. Villagers who once sought charms now swore they had feared them. Old favors became curses. Old debts became evidence. The community turned upon itself, eager to cleanse by sacrifice. The rope grew heavy with every name spoken, tightening around Pendle's neck. Thus the spark became full, and full became inferno. What began with quarrel on the road now engulfed families, neighbors, and children. Pendle Hill, silent and watchful, bore witness as fear consumed its people. The hill did not judge, but history did, and it remembered. Lancaster Castle loomed grim above the River Lune, its thick walls holding centuries of judgment. In 1612, it became stage for Pendle's Witches. Prisoners were led through its gates, shackled, cold, and afraid. The stones themselves seemed to whisper, for countless had passed through before, never to return. The accused were held in the dark dungeon, known as the Well Tower. Damp walls dripped, straw rotted, air stank of despair. Families who once lived on moors now crouched in shadow, awaiting trial. For many, punishment had begun long before verdict. The castle was both prison and prophecy. The courtroom echoed with authority. Judges in black, clerks with quills, and ministers with Bibles filled to the chamber. The accused stood small, dwarfed by power. Their voices trembled while officials' words carried weight of crown and church. What began as quarrels on moors was now law's theatre. Lancaster's trials were spectacle. Crowds gathered, eager to witness. Fear became entertainment. Villagers who once traded whispers now saw them spoken aloud as charges. Testimony became performance, each word amplified by the solemn stone walls. The court's echo gave gossip the weight of scripture. Thus Lancaster Castle became crucible where fear hardened into history. Its towers stood as silent witnesses while families broke, neighbors betrayed, and justice bent beneath superstition. The gallows awaited, but the castle itself had already condemned. Pendle's witches were bound not by rope alone, but by stone. The trial opened with neighbors' voices. Villagers testified of curses and charms, of milk that curdled and butter that spoiled. They spoke of livestock dying after quarrels, of children sickening after insults. What had been gossip in taverns became the testimony in stone halls. Every misfortune gained a name. One neighbor swore that Demdike's muttered words had killed her cow. Another claimed Chattox's clay figures doomed a child. The court recorded it all, as though these tales were truth. To deny was useless, to speak was dangerous. Silence itself became suspicion. Each voice tightened the rope. The judges listened intently, nodding as fear was dressed as fact. Clerks scribbled, ministers prayed, and every villager who testified believed themselves purging evil. Yet their words condemned not the devil but neighbors who had once shared bread. Community became its own accuser, devouring itself. The accused stood silent, powerless against tide of voices. They could not undo years of gossip, nor deny memories sharpened by fear. Their poverty spoke louder than their words. The court did not see hunger or desperation. It saw witches cloaked in rags. Thus, testimony piled like stones. Each accusation added weight, crushing hope. The court did not seek truth but certainty, and villagers gave it eagerly. Their words carried the power of gallows. Each tale, whether false or true, became thread in rope already tightening. The trial's most chilling moment came when Janet Device, only 9 years old, was brought forth. Small, frightened, she stood before judges. Her words carried more weight than she could know, for a child was seen as innocent, incapable of lies. Her testimony cut deeper than any adult's. Janet raised her hand and accused her own family. Mother, brother, sister. She claimed they had gathered with witches, feasted with the devil, cursed neighbors. Her words struck the court silent, then filled it with whispers. The image of a child condemning blood bound the rope tighter than any other voice. Her mother, Elizabeth Device, screamed in protest, begging her daughter to stop. The courtroom descended into chaos, but the judges silenced her, insisting the child spoke truth. A daughter's betrayal became Crown's weapon, turning family into spectacle. History would never forget the child's voice that damned her kin. Janet's words were shaped by fear, by pressure, perhaps by manipulation. Yet the court embraced them. To doubt her was to doubt innocence itself. Her testimony sealed fates. 10 would die because a child spoke. Pendle's tragedy sharpened into horror. Thus innocence was twisted into blade. Janet's voice became instrument of judgment, her memory forever burdened. Pendle's tale was no longer only feud of families. It was betrayal of blood, recorded in stone, echoed in gallows. The moors themselves seemed to darken as her words fell. The trial became theatre. Crowds pressed into Lancaster's hall, eager for spectacle. Ministers thundered of Satan, judges lectured of law, and villagers leaned forward to hear each accusation. Fear and fascination intertwined, making tragedy into performance. Pendle's misery became England's entertainment. Every detail was exaggerated, every tale sharpened. Confessions of spirits, of flying, of feasts with the devil were repeated until they filled imagination. The court fed on fear, drawing strength from gasps of crowd. What began as trial became sermon, carnival, and execution all at once. The accused were powerless, their pleas drowned by noise. Each denial was mocked, each word twisted. The court did not seek balance. It sought victory. The witches were condemned before rope touched neck. The law had become spectacle, and superstition its stage. Lancaster's trial, it echoed across the kingdom. News spread, retold as proof of witches everywhere. Pendle became symbol, its hill transformed into warning. For England's people, the trial confirmed fears. Witches lived among them, ready to curse, ready to kill. Thus justice and theatre blurred. The trial was not only judgment of Pendle, but performance for all England. In its echo, fear deepened, ensuring witches would haunt imagination long after gallows emptied. Pendle's trial was not end, but beginning of legend. At last the verdict came. 10 were condemned to hang. Alazon Device, her mother Elizabeth, Anne Whittle Chattox, and others. 1 was acquitted. Another, Margaret Pearson, was spared death but branded witch by law. Demdike, the old matriarch, died in prison before judgment could reach her. The condemned were led to the gallows at Lancaster Moor. Ropes swayed against the sky, mist curling around the hill. Families wept, crowds watched, ministers prayed. Each name called was another knot in history, tying Pendle to fear forever. The executions were swift, but not silent. Cries rose, prayers echoed, and silence followed. The bodies hung as warning, swaying in cold wind. The hill bore witness, its shadow stretching long. Pendle's witches became both victims and symbols, their deaths etched into England's memory. For villagers, the trial ended, but suspicion did not. The moors still whispered, families still feuded, hunger still gnawed. Fear had been fed, not sated. Pendle's tragedy ensured that witches would never vanish from English thought. The gallows planted roots deeper than graves. Thus the trial closed, but legend began. Lancaster's verdicts outlived its judges, its parchment, its ropes. Pendle's witches entered myth. Their names whispered not as neighbours, but as warnings. What began on a road with a peddler ended in shadow of gallows, echoing through centuries. The executions echoed beyond Lancaster. 10 bodies swayed, but their deaths rippled through England. Word spread of Pendle, where witches lived among poor and cursed their neighbours. Pamphlets retold the trial, each copy sharpening fear. The gallows did not silence suspicion. They gave it voice to travel further. Travellers carried tales to distant villages. Ministers preached Pendle as warning, proof that witches thrived in England's soil. Fear found new ground, planted by words and memory. Pendle was no longer just a hill in Lancashire. It was symbol of hidden evil, waiting in every parish. For families left behind, the echo was personal. Children orphaned, kin disgraced, homes emptied by rope. Poverty deepened, hunger sharpened, shame lingered. Survivors lived not only with loss, but with stain of witch blood, whispered wherever they went. The gallows reached beyond death into daily life. Lancaster's trial became example. Other villages found their own witches, inspired by Pendle's story. Accusation became fashion, witch hunts spreading like infection. Pendle's tragedy multiplied, repeated wherever fear and hunger met. What began with a peddler and a curse became contagion of belief. Thus the echo of gallows was not silence, but chorus. Each rope swung as reminder, each pamphlet carried fear. Pendle's dead became voices as louder than life, their fate binding England in shadow. The executions ended lives, but began legend. Janet Device, the child who spoke against her family, survived. But survival carried curse. Though spared rope, she bore weight of betrayal. Villagers whispered her name with awe and suspicion. She was both instrument of law and traitor to blood, marked forever by her testimony. As she grew, Janet remained shadowed. The trial followed her like ghost, never loosening its grip. She could not escape her words, spoken at 9 years old. To some, she was proof of innocence. To others, devil's pawn. Her life became long echo of that day in court. Years later, Janet herself would be accused of witchcraft. In 1634, she stood again before Lancaster judges, this time as prisoner. The child who condemned became condemned. Irony hung heavy, but pity was scarce. She was judged not as child, but as witch, her past sealing her fate. Her voice, once sharp enough to hang 10, now faltered. Witnesses claimed she cursed, charmed, consorted with spirits. The court needed no proof. Her name was evidence. Janet's survival was not mercy, but postponement. The law that had used her now consumed her. Thus Janet's life closed as tragic mirror. Her childhood testimony shaped Pendle's doom, and her adulthood carried its shadow. She became symbol not of justice, but of cycle, how fear devours even those it first spares. Pendle's curse was not only rope, but memory. Pendle Hill grew into symbol. No longer just moorland, it became place of dread and curiosity. Visitors whispered of witches who once lived beneath its slopes. The trials were retold in taverns and sermons alike, until Pendle was known across England as land cursed by Devil's Shadow. The hill's silhouette itself gained power. Mist rolling across its crest seemed haunted. Every gust of wind carried rumor. Children were warned not to wander, lest witches' ghosts linger. Pendle became geography of fear, its soil soaked not only in poverty but in legend. Centuries passed, but the story did not fade. Writers and chroniclers preserved names of Demdike, Chattox, Device. Their reputations outlived them, etched into ink. The poor women of Lancashire became immortal not as neighbours, but as witches, their identities rewritten by history's hand. The legend served as cautionary tale. Ministers used it to warn against sin, parents to frighten children, rulers to justify law. Pendle's trial became lesson. Poverty and superstition could birth evil, or at least evidence of it. The witches' deaths were explained as necessary, their humanity erased. Thus Pendle endured not only as place, but as story. Its moorland bore silence, but England's imagination roared with whispers. The gallows rotted, but memory grew stronger. Pendle Hill became eternal stage, where fear played forever. By later centuries, Pendle's shadow became attraction. Travellers came to see Hill of Witches, to walk moors where fear once ruled. Folklore guides recited tales, blending history and legend until truth was blurred. Pendle became not only memory of fear, but spectacle for curious. Shops sold charms, inns told stories, and locals profited from legacy. Witches once condemned now became currency, their names whispered for coin. What once doomed families now sustained villages. History turned curse into commerce, tragedy into trade. Stories grew stranger with each retelling. Ghosts of Demdike seen on misty slopes, Janet's voice carried on wind, Chattox's curses lingering in air. Pendle's folklore thrived not on fact, but on fear's persistence. Imagination fed economy as much as truth. Yet beneath the surface, memory remained dark. For locals, the story was wound as well as legend. Poverty, betrayal, and death lingered in soil. The tourists saw witches. Descendants remembered mothers. Pendle's folklore was mask for tragedy, one that never fully hid scars. Thus Pendle became both carnival and crypt. Visitors carried home tales of witches, leaving coins behind. The hill endured as monument not of stone but of story, where laughter and sorrow intertwined. Pendle remained haunted by history, by memory, by commerce of fear. Pendle's witches endured as warning. Their story told how fear could twist neighbors into enemies, how poverty could brand survival as sin, how law could weaponize rumor. The true witchcraft was not in charms, but in suspicion itself, binding community in chains stronger than rope. Ministers used Pendle as sermon, historians as lesson, artists as inspiration. Each retelling shaped meaning, sometimes devils, sometimes martyrs, sometimes symbols of womanhood oppressed. Pendle's witches became mirrors, reflecting fear of each age. Their tale was never still. It shifted with needs of storytellers. For England, Pendle was scar. It showed how easily law could bend to fear, how quickly faith could become weapon, how fragile truth was when weighed against terror. The moors carried silence, but history shouted. Pendle's witches were remembered not as forgotten poor, but as eternal archetypes. Today, their names echo in books, films, and rituals. Some reclaim them as heroines, others as warnings. But all agree, Pendle's witches were not merely women of 1612. They became timeless figures. Their tragedy warns us still of power misused and fear unbridled. Thus Pendle's legacy endures. From mist to ink, from gallows to screens, the witches of Lancashire remind us that true curse was never theirs, but ours. In fear's shadow, humanity condemns itself. Pendle is lesson carved not in stone, but in memory eternal. Pendle was not alone. Across oceans, whispers of witches echoed. In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts burned with fear, its children accusing neighbors, its court echoing Lancaster. Though seas apart, the stories mirrored: poverty, suspicion, faith sharpened into blade. Pendle's fire smoldered in New World soil, proving witch hunts were contagion without borders. Salem's girls claimed visions, torments inflicted by witches unseen. Their cries were Janet's echo, a child's voice turned into law. Dozens were accused, many hanged. The pattern repeated. Confessions under pressure, neighbors betraying neighbors, superstition weaponized by authority. Pendle had written script, Salem performed it. The trials traveled further still. Germany, Scotland, France, each carried its own hunts, its own gallows. From moors to mountains, rivers to forests, women were bound and judged. The witch became universal villain, feared in every land, condemned by every pulpit. Fear spoke many tongues, but always the same word: witch. Pendle's story became part of larger chorus. The details differed, but melody was constant. Suspicion fueled by hunger, faith twisted by fear, justice drowned by superstition. The witch trials were not accidents of place. They were rituals of control, repeated wherever power met desperation. Thus Pendle was no isolated wound. It was one scar in body of humanity, shared across borders. From Lancashire to Salem, from Europe to colonies, the figure of the witch spread like shadow of gallows. The eternal stage widened, and Pendle stood among many, bound in history's chain. The witch became vessel for blame. Failed harvests, plagues, storms, all laid at her feet. When cows sickened or bread spoiled, she was accused. Witchcraft explained chaos, gave order to misfortune. To name a witch was to believe the world made sense, even when hunger or sickness ruled. Women bore weight most heavily. Widows, healers, midwives. Those living at margins became targets. The witch was not random figure, but symbol of outsider, woman beyond control of men or church. Fear was sharpened by gender, turning independence into evidence. Children, too, carried mark of scapegoat. Their cries, visions or spitals, or misbehavior were pinned on witches. The weak were shielded by accusing weaker. Thus scapegoating spared no one. It bound communities by sacrificing chosen few. In Pendle, the accused were poor, female, old, or despised. The pattern was everywhere. The scapegoat served power. To accuse was to distract from deeper wounds: poverty, corruption, hunger. By naming witches, rulers preserved order. Villagers too found comfort. Blame shifted, guilt removed, fear made bearable. The witch absorbed it all. Her body became canvas of society's anxieties. Thus the witch was more than woman. She was symbol. In her we see human need to cast shadow outward, to burn fear in another's flesh. The scapegoat was eternal, and Pendle was one chapter in story as old as mankind. Centuries later, the witch returned not as villain, but heroine. Feminist voices reclaimed her image, seeing strength where history saw sin. The witch became symbol of women's resistance, of survival in face of oppression. Pendle's poor women were remembered not as demons, but as mothers, healers, and scapegoats. In modern spirituality, witchcraft was reborn. No longer curses and pacts, but rituals of empowerment, herbs, candles, circles. What once condemned became sacred. The word witch itself shifted, from curse to crown. Pendle's Hill saw not fear but pilgrimage, as seekers honored memory of those once damned. Art and literature gave voice to forgotten. Novels retold Pendle's gore tragedy with sympathy. Films depicted witches as complex, neither wholly evil nor saint. Each retelling challenged silence of history, offering humanity to those erased. Pendle's women gained voices denied in court. Reclamation spread beyond Pendle. Across the world, witches became archetypes of empowerment, symbols of queerness, otherness, freedom. What once justified rope now justified resistance. The witch endured not as devil's servant, but as mirror of strength. Thus the witch's shadow shifted. From gallows to altar, from curse to liberation, she endured. Pendle's legacy became not only warning of fear, but symbol of survival. In the witch's name, history itself was rewritten. Pendle's story seeped into culture. Plays staged the trials. Novels imagined the accused. Films gave voice to their fear. The witches became icons, appearing on posters, screens, and stories told at fireside. Their tragedy transformed into entertainment, their names into mythic shorthand for fear. Children dressed as witches at Halloween, unaware of history beneath costume. Pendle became backdrop for festivals, walks, and museums. The image of broom and pointed hat carried echoes of gallows, though few noticed. Fear had become fun, but shadow remained. Scholars studied the trial, unearthing details of poverty, rivalry, religion. They sought truth behind superstition, history behind legend. Their work preserved humanity of accused, showing them not monsters, but victims of fear. The archive became graveyard where names were honored anew. In music and art, witches inspired darkness and beauty alike. Songs mourned them, paintings honored them, films reinvented them. The witch endured as muse, feeding imagination. Pendle's tragedy birthed creativity, as if suffering demanded expression. Thus culture carried witches far from Lancashire. They became archetypes, endlessly reimagined, yet always tied to shadow of Pendle Hill. History and art walked together, ensuring witches never vanished. Their curse became immortality. From 1612 to today, Pendle endures. The hill still rises, mist curling around its crest. Villagers live beneath shadow, tourists climb slopes, scholars trace archives. The witches are gone, but their voices remain, whispered by wind, echoed in pages, immortalized in memory. The story closes not with gallows, but with mirror. For witch is not only figure of past, but reflection of present. Whenever fear demands scapegoat, witch returns. Whenever power bends truth, witch stands accused. Pendle teaches us we still live in its shadow. The eternal witch is not woman on moor, but archetype in mind. She is outsider, feared and condemned, yet also survivor, reclaimed and revered. From curse to crown, from rope to ritual, she endures as timeless mirror of humanity. The montage sweeps, gallows of Lancaster, moors of Pendle, courtrooms of Salem, flames of Europe, festivals of today. The witch walks through them all, changing shape yet never vanishing. She is eternal shadow, carried in every age. Thus the story ends where it began, with fear, with memory, with shadow. The witches of Pendle were poor women of Lancashire, yet their legacy is endless. Their tragedy warns, their memory teaches, their image survives. The eternal witch howls still, not from moors, but from within us all.